and I really appreciate the kind invitation, the kind introduction. I'm really looking forward to your comments, and just wanted to point out that the paper I circulate is very much a work in progress that comes out of my interests, the larger interests in the relationship between people and things, especially infrastructure objects that are mediated by the histories of imperialism and socialism. So I know some of you are already familiar with the book, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But that project came out of my concern with the destruction of material and ecological worlds, and how people set about collectively rebuilding their lives and their communities materially, socially, and infrastructurally in the aftermath of devastating imperial violence that wiped out the entire city. And so I argue in the book that place annihilation turned the city into an urban lab for modernist experimentation with the introduction of innovative built forms and media for imagining the built environment, which often did not fit with the reality of the post-war conditions at that time, but which nonetheless created new forms of sociality and citizen-state relations as social and spatial organization radically changed to engender an entirely different affective environment, or actually an affective atmosphere and a sensory experience of the city that was not appreciated by all, but became the terrain for forging new subjectivities and imaginaries of urban possibility. So what I thought I would do today is to talk a little bit about how I came to concrete and cement, which along with bricks were foundational to materializing the new world that I talk about in the book. To provide a kind of broader analytical framework for the essay that I circulated, which argues for more attention to the gender division of the labor of infrastructure, which is often unmarked or coded male. So it's very much a case study rather than a theoretical intervention per se, but my approach is very much aligned with feminist anthropologists and geographers who aim to transcend binaries, to think relationally and intersectionally, so across gender and class and race and heteropatriarchy, for example, to consider how the study of urban infrastructure offers new ways to think about gender relations, gendered inequalities, especially in relation to infrastructural violence, and gendered meanings and affects tied to matter that moves matter, as infrastructure is often described, and vice versa, how an attention to gender might offer new insights into the social and material realities or relations of infrastructure, as well as how infrastructures mediate notions of belonging and relations between state and citizens as subjects governed through urban materiality. So my argument in the paper is fairly straightforward. The labor of women in building and maintaining infrastructures that mediate urban environments remains largely invisible. And because of this, banal materials like cement and concrete are a topic of feminist concern, precisely because of the embodied ways in which they produce gendered subjectivities, while the gendered body itself came to act as infrastructure and as embodied labor central to political imagination of particular futures, but also people's own urban aspirations. So let me start on a bit of a tangent here by sharing some thoughts on the melting of solids to get us thinking about modernity and the material forms and matters that constitute urban life. So in his book, Liquid Modernity, Zygmunt Bauman describes the liquefaction of substandard, shape-shifting, pre-modern forms in the quest to build a modern social and geopolitical order that would render the world manageable and predictable in order to ensure what he called lasting solidity. Among others, he argued that modernity is a regenerative process of clearing the residue of a defective past, or of melting the solids into thin air, as the Communist Manifesto so famously stated, to infer a condition of creative construction that emerges from the detritus of decay and ruin. Now, while Bauman was thinking about the disintegration of social and political forms and their untethering from the economy, I was inspired by his words to think about modernity's melting powers in relation to material practices and matters of materiality in response to Ingold's call to, quote unquote, bring the materials back in and to give matter, the stuff of time, its due. So I began to think more deeply and ecologically about cement, the primary ingredient in concrete, and the role it has played in building a new and more solid world, insofar as it came to symbolize both literally and metaphorically the archetypical quote-unquote melting of solids as a standard feature of modern landscapes, formed through the violent extraction and crushing of limestone heated at high temperatures to transform its porous properties into the basis of a strong, quote-unquote, truly solid modernity. Now, this obsession with solidity and with conquering the vernacular deficiency through durable material forms formed the benchmark of colonial imaginaries of a progressive concrete futurity. And as I wrote in the essay citing Penny Harvey, cement was the matter through which colonial visions of conquest became manifest in the built environment. It was the stuff of empire that was essential to the mission to both govern the population and accumulate capital while concretizing its hold on power. While the history of cement in the global South is thus closely tied to colonial extractive capitalism and its modalities of labor exploitation, the production of construction materials and building technologies like cement to produce a modern, so sturdy, solid, lasting built environment would remain a matter of post-colonial political possibility, which reflected new social and gender arrangements and, in emerging socialist countries, new relations of production, with surplus value to be redistributed to the proletariat in theory. So decolonization was bound to concrete aspirations, not unlike its colonial predecessors, but in accordance with its own institutionalized material practices, legitimizing authorities, and gendered labor regimes. In Vietnam, after the War for Independence, state officials called for the mass production of quality cement at an unprecedented scale and speed. As you can see, well, if you're able to read Vietnamese, but here in Vietnamese, the newspaper here is calling for fast-paced and huge volumes of cement production, with the assistance of socialist allies, as these were collective world-making projects to rebuild vital infrastructure and lay the foundation, literally, for the road to socialist modernization. And yet by no means was the relationship between cement and modernity natural or inevitable, despite being an affective, politically charged matter, owing to optimism about time moving forward or the overcoming of backwardness. While spectacular concrete structures like dams and bridges and buildings are often perceived to be visible markers of progress, the grander, the more modern, too much of the composite material risked allegations of being haplessly not yet modern, as in the gray, brutalist landscapes of socialism considered inhumane and substandard, right? And I know Maria knows these criticisms quite well. They're also in her research. Thus, calls to liquidize these socialist concrete dream worlds as modernity once again turned on itself, this time in the service of capital. Moreover, the symbolic association of Southern cement worlds with inferior quality, the cracks in concrete surfaces suggestive of corruption and criminality in unregulated construction projects that fall short of global standards, show the ways in which the meanings of concrete are neither fixed nor detached from novel forms of racial and temporal othering. This reminds me of when the high-rise condo in Florida collapsed a couple months ago. And a common media response that was repeated time and time again was, how can this be? This type of thing only happens in the third world, right? That concrete doesn't buckle in the United States. So for countries in the global South in particular, the connections between solidity and modernity through anthropogenic agents like concrete thus had to be established and maintained, also to challenge Eurocentric notions of progress through its prescribed standards that mapped onto civilizational hierarchies. So in my attention to concrete, rather than look to vertical cities as much of the really wonderful ethnographic literature does, or to limestone quarries as sites where post-colonial claims to modernity were once made and contested, I began to pursue my interest in concrete initially by shifting the gaze elsewhere, to the mundane infrastructural objects at the center of material life that traverse the fault lines between national autonomy and global political economy, and by that I mean both socialist and capitalist circulations. I turned then to bags of cement. And this is how I arrived at the project and the essay that I circulated. So let me show you a cartoon image here. As the cartoon in this image shows, bag of cement being thrown out of the back, and as you can read on the translation, the secret behind potholes, and I've added a little, providing equal access to durable material worlds. So as this cartoon image shows, bags of cement functioned as a form of wealth for rural households, and their illicit redistribution was less about corruption than with a kind of anti-urban resistance through the provision of equal access to modern concrete dream worlds. Here we see the affective capacities of building technologies that reorganize people's material worlds while mediating social relations. So let me say a few words then about modernity as a bag of cement. Like the piles of baked clay bricks that I've written about elsewhere as utopian objects of desire associated with the female labor of post-war recovery, bags of cement are ubiquitous in post-colonial landscapes, and not only at construction sites that showcase the booms and busts of development. Embedded in power relations and networks of social relations, woven polypropylene sacks are similarly world and future building objects that circulate widely, even globally, while continuing to serve multiple purposes at various scales, often beyond their intended utility. Nationally, cement bags pointed to the finished and unfinished or unbuilt projects of modernization that mark cycles of growth and stagnation. Individuals, on the other hand, often transformed empty sacks into versatile materiality, filling them with organic matter like sand and soil for flood control, or perimeter fortification to mark private property. And here they're filled with leaves. As industrial kitsch, entrepreneurs have upcycled cement bags into backpacks for sale to international tourists, promoting the durability of the lightweight plastic mesh bags that traders salvage to transport bulk commodities to bustling markets, also clandestinely across international borders. Historically, cement sacks were objects of imperial encounter that bespoke of colonial dispossession and a loss of state sovereignty. In Vietnam, construction on Indochina's first cement factory on the outskirts of Haiphong in 1899 that I talk about in the essay marked one of France's largest extractivist projects to supply an expanding global circulation construction market. The circulation of across Asia of bags of quote-unquote dragon cement imprinted with a red serpentine logo to signify imperial strength and power provided the material and technological scaffolding of French modernity to deliver the region from pre-modern backwardness. And here I'll show you the logo that has been appropriated by the Huanglong Cement Company. Today, bags of cement speak to the project of decolonization as an ongoing negotiation between national and global interests that inscribe state legitimacy through alignment with international standards deemed rational, objective, and befitting of modern nation building. As such, they are objects of bureaucratic regulation and discipline that transmit symbolic information about how post-colonial countries stake a claim to modernity and carve out a place in the modern world while contributing to global supply chains. They aim to do so, however, on their own terms and in adherence with their own regulatory regimes that have been equally extractive and ecologically destructive. Here, a limestone quarry in the Northern Highlands. As standardizing objects in Vietnam at the nexus of multiple material worlds, gendered forms of labor, urban imaginaries, and relations of power, bags of cement express diverse values, meanings, and claims to compliance and accountability. As such, they provide insight into the assemblage of multiple governing agents and laboring bodies at work in standardizing the building materials industry to better manage the performance of concrete structures locally and globally. In other words, cement bags do more than carry the powdery binding substance that, when mixed with aggregate and water, produce the universal construction material known as concrete. The bags themselves act as modern bureaucratic artifacts or texts that document what the intended contents are, as well as how these materials are expected to perform, while invisibilizing the very infrastructural labor needed at multiple nodes in the production and distribution chain to realize those modernist dream worlds. Scholars of new materialism are quick to remind us that matter does not always behave as predicted. For example, cracks in foundations owing to atmospheric changes or perhaps to pilfered materials. To mitigate uncertainty about the manufacturing process and material strength, bags of cement communicate signs or stock information to certify accreditation and reduction of risk of unruly substances, right? The ISO and the various accreditation agencies that put their stamp on the cement bags. As I outlined in the paper that you read, the history of cement production in Vietnam is a transnational story of locally sourced materials, sedimentary rock and labor, mostly female, that acts with global technologies. And this was here an example of imported machines and equipment, first from China and then later from East Germany after its bombing, to build modern concrete worlds. It is closely tied to shifting geopolitical interests and economic imperatives, from French conquest with its export-oriented production to state-led industrialization, initially dependent on imported cement from Allied socialist countries until newly built precast concrete factories could serve the needs of regional socialist development, to market-oriented production to supply a rapidly growing commercial construction industry, also internationally. So Vietnam's current 86 plants, and that's up from one from the 1940s, exported an estimated 34 million tons of cement and clinker in 2019, with construction on factories with even larger domestic production capacity underway despite a sluggish pandemic economy. Inclusion in world export markets for products like cement is not an inevitable effect of capitalism. Post-colonial countries like Vietnam face strong pressure to ensure their commodities meet the quote-unquote normative standards of quality management and assurance set by global regulatory institutions. This pressure has been acutely felt in late and post-socialist countries, where standardizers sought to correct the flaws of socialism and its disorderly state enterprises that produce substandard goods. In Vietnam, these substandard goods are implicated in what Stoller has called the less perceptible, violent accruals of imperial debris that continue to inflict ecological and biological harm. For example, the US market has accused Vietnam of dumping its catfish and called for boycotts because of presumed toxic contamination from Agent Orange, which renders both humans and non-humans as abominations. In other words, standards are not only about improving quality control to reduce inconsistencies in manufacturing, they also work to ensure capitalist discipline and racial hierarchies in the face of an ascending Asia. So let me come back to cement and wrap up. The questions of standard and of quality imperialism in the building materials industry and in the production of durable concrete worlds through gendered labor regimes raises questions about neoliberalism and its standardizing modalities that facilitate the flow of capital and goods through consensus, the embrace of the global market rather than coercion as experienced under colonialism. The bags of cement that have their own material history, sewn, filled, and sealed by women, are thus good to think with as mundane objects that deploy potent cultural symbols to express nationalist ideals and sovereign sensibilities, while contributing to the overall aesthetics of nation building, both materially through concrete structures and ideologically through labor discipline to produce gendered subjects who become emblems of modernity. For example, company logos draw on powerful imagery associated with origin narratives and struggles for sovereignty, from mythic animals like war elephants used to fight against Chinese invasion, to potent infrastructural symbols like this one here, from the famous Hamzong Bridge that withstood hundreds of US bomb attacks, symbolizing the resilience of infrastructure in the face of foreign aggression. Engaged in infrastructural warfare. Incidentally, the bridge would eventually collapse, but it was rebuilt provisionally within days, owing to the teams of young female volunteer militia forces who were tasked with the repair of critical urban infrastructure, a reminder of how, getting back to the main points of the essay and actually my book, infrastructures are built and maintained disproportionately by women. Back to the key image there, often migrant women, and that more attention needs to be paid to the gendered and classed bodies that perform infrastructural labor across scales in the city. But another key argument here in both the essay and the book is the fundamental disconnect or tensions between lofty utopian planning and constrained post-war realities that materialize in the form in the plan for concrete panel factories, for example, that expose the incompatibility of modernism's universalist claims to scalability, as we see in this image of the failed promise or the unmaterialized promise of mechanization, where concrete panels would then have to be produced by hand. Okay, I will end it there and open up the conversation for any questions about either the essay, the book for those of you who have read it, or even my commentary and wider perspective on the essay that I just gave. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for, clap. I can see Maria with her clapping hands. Yeah, we don't get the nice round of applause that we would normally get in the seminar room, but you can see some clapping hands. So thank